What happens when the most influential figure in human history simply vanishes from all records for nearly 2 decades? Does the silence of the scriptures conceal the greatest spiritual education ever undertaken? Welcome, soul traveler, to the Eternal Library. Today we dive into one of the most profound and enigmatic secrets that has been hidden from humanity for over 2 millennia, the lost years of Jesus of Nazareth, those 18 crucial years between his appearance as a 12-year-old prodigy in the temple and his emergence at 30 as a fully realized master. Years that hold the key to understanding not just the source of his extraordinary wisdom but the very nature of spiritual initiation itself. For what the Church has concealed and what scholars have dismissed as mere speculation reveals itself to be nothing less than the most comprehensive mystery school education in recorded history, a journey that took the young Yeshua ben Yosef through the sacred centers of learning across the ancient world, from the mystery schools of Egypt where Moses himself was initiated, to the hidden monasteries of Tibet where the deepest secrets of consciousness transformation have been preserved for thousands of years, from the Essene communities of Mount Carmel where the Dead Sea Scrolls reveal advanced practices of purification and divine communion, to the mystery temples of India where Krishna's teachings on the unity of all existence were transmitted through direct experience rather than mere philosophy. The Gospel of Luke tells us that at age 12, Jesus was found in the temple, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions, and all who heard him were amazed at his understanding and his answers. Yet immediately after this profound display of wisdom beyond his years, the canonical Gospels fall into complete silence, not mentioning him again until he appears at the Jordan River to be baptized by John at age 30, but this silence is not accidental, it is deliberate. For the early Church Fathers understood that revealing the true source of Jesus' education would fundamentally challenge the doctrine of his unique divinity, showing instead that his consciousness was developed through the same ancient practices available to all serious seekers of truth. The Tibetan master Lobsang Rampa, though controversial in his identity, preserved oral traditions speaking of a young Jewish teacher who spent years in the Himalayas learning the deepest practices of consciousness expansion, and the Indian text known as the Bhavishya Purana, dating to the 3rd century BCE but containing later additions, specifically mentions Ishamasi, or Jesus Christ traveling to India and receiving initiation in the sacred sciences, while the Russian explorer Nicholas Notovich claimed to have discovered in 1887 at the Hemis Monastery in Ladakh ancient manuscripts describing the journey of Saint Issa, clearly Jesus, who came to India at age 14 and spent years studying with Buddhist and Hindu masters before returning to Palestine as a fully realized teacher. The monastery of Saint Issa in Kashmir still preserves traditions of Jesus having lived and taught there, and the Rosable Shrine in Srinagar is believed by many locals to contain his actual tomb, though these claims remain disputed by mainstream scholarship. Yet the circumstantial evidence grows stronger when we examine the striking parallels between Jesus' teachings and the advanced spiritual practices of the East, parallels that cannot be explained by mere coincidence but point to direct transmission of ancient wisdom through proper initiation. The mystery school system of the ancient world was a vast network of interconnected spiritual universities, each preserving different aspects of the perennial philosophy that underlies all authentic spiritual traditions. The Egyptian mysteries at Memphis, Thebes, and Dendera taught the science of death and resurrection through direct experience of consciousness separation from the physical body, the same knowledge later encoded in the Egyptian Book of the Dead and the Tibetan Bardo Thodol. While the Greek mysteries at Eleusis revealed the divine nature of the human soul through carefully controlled psychedelic experiences using the Kykeon, a sacred brew containing ergot alkaloids that produced profound mystical states, and these same consciousness-altering substances were known to the mystery schools throughout the Mediterranean world, including the Essene communities where Jesus almost certainly received his initial training. The Essenes, as revealed through the Dead Sea Scrolls discovered at Qumran, were far more than a simple Jewish sect. They were advanced practitioners of solar worship, sexual alchemy, and consciousness transformation techniques that bore striking resemblances to both Egyptian and Eastern practices. Their community rule describes elaborate purification rituals, communal property ownership, and advanced healing methods using sound, light, and sacred geometry, while their understanding of the Merkaba, the divine light vehicle described in Ezekiel's vision, demonstrates knowledge of advanced consciousness projection techniques that were common to mystery schools throughout the ancient world, and it was among these Essenes that the young Jesus first encountered the possibility of human divinity through direct spiritual practice rather than mere theological study. The journey from Essene initiate to fully realized master would have required exposure to the complete spectrum of ancient wisdom traditions, beginning with the Egyptian mysteries where Moses himself, according to Josephus and other ancient historians, was trained in all the learning of the Egyptians, becoming mighty in both words and deeds. For the Egyptian mystery schools preserved the most ancient wisdom of Atlantis and Lemuria, teaching the divine science of consciousness manipulation. Through sacred geometry, sound frequencies, and the precise understanding of subtle energy currents that flow through both the human body and the earth itself, knowledge that Jesus would later demonstrate in his ability to heal through touch, multiply food through manipulation of atomic structure, and even resurrect the dead through direct intervention in the consciousness-matter interface. The Temple of Dendera in Egypt, with its zodiac ceiling and astronomical calculations accurate to thousands of years, reveals that the Egyptian priesthood possessed scientific knowledge that far exceeded what mainstream archaeology attributes to ancient civilizations, including detailed understanding of precession cycles, planetary influences on human consciousness, and the use of specific geometric proportions to create sacred spaces that naturally induce altered states of consciousness. The same principles later incorporated into Gothic cathedral architecture through the Knights Templar who had discovered these secrets during their occupation of Solomon's temple, itself built according to the same sacred geometric principles preserved in Egyptian mystery schools and transmitted eastward to India and Tibet, where they became foundational to both Hindu temple construction and Buddhist stupa design. The young Jesus, traveling eastward along the ancient Silk Road trade routes that connected Palestine to India and beyond, would have encountered the Zoroastrian mysteries of Persia, where the concept of the eternal battle between light and darkness provided the theological framework for understanding the dual nature of existence, while the fire temples maintained the sacred flames that were understood to be direct manifestations of divine consciousness, techniques for communing with these elemental forces that Jesus would later demonstrate in his transfiguration on Mount Tabor, where his body literally blazed with light, a phenomenon well documented in advanced meditation practices where prolonged concentration on the subtle fire element produces actual photonic emissions from the practitioner's cellular structure, as confirmed by modern researchers like Dr. Fritz Albert Popp, who discovered that all living cells emit coherent light in the form of biophotons, the same divine light that mystics throughout history have learned to concentrate and project through advanced spiritual practice. The journey to India would have taken Jesus through the centers of learning established by Alexander the Great's conquests, where Greek philosophical schools like the Neoplatonists had already begun synthesizing Eastern and Western wisdom traditions, creating the intellectual framework that would later influence Christian theology through figures like Origen and Clement of Alexandria, who were clearly familiar with Hindu and Buddhist concepts, though they could not openly acknowledge this influence without being branded as heretics, for the early church was engaged in a desperate struggle to establish its unique authority and could not admit that Jesus' teachings were part of a universal wisdom tradition available to sincere seekers throughout the ancient world. In India, the young Jesus would have encountered the Vedantic teaching that Atman, the individual soul, and Brahman, the universal consciousness, are fundamentally identical, a realization that he later expressed in statements like, "I and the Father are one," and "the kingdom of heaven is within you," teachings that were considered blasphemous by Orthodox Judaism but were perfectly consistent with advanced Vedantic philosophy, while the practice of Raja Yoga, the royal path of meditation, would have provided the systematic training in consciousness control that later manifested as Jesus' ability to enter deep meditative states, communicate directly with divine consciousness, and maintain perfect equanimity even under extreme physical and emotional stress, abilities that require decades of intensive practice under the guidance of fully realized masters. The Buddhist monasteries of northern India and the Himalayan regions preserved the teachings of Gautama Buddha on the nature of suffering, the impermanence of all phenomena, and the systematic methodology for achieving liberation from the cycle of birth and death, concepts that Jesus later incorporated into his teachings about the necessity of spiritual rebirth, the temporary nature of earthly existence, and the importance of non-attachment to material possessions, while the advanced tantric practices maintained in certain esoteric Buddhist and Hindu lineages would have revealed the sacred nature of sexual energy and its role in consciousness transformation, knowledge that later influenced the development of Christian mystical traditions like those preserved by the Gnostics, who understood that divine union could be achieved through the proper channeling of sexual energy in sacred partnership, practices that were violently suppressed by the Orthodox Church but continued in secret. Traditions like those of the Cathars and later the alchemical schools of medieval Europe. The Tibetan monasteries, repositories of the most advanced consciousness technologies developed over thousands of years of systematic experimentation, would have exposed Jesus to practices like the rainbow body achievement, where advanced practitioners literally dissolve their physical form into pure light, a phenomenon documented in recent times by researchers like David Wilcock and witnessed by multiple observers, including Chinese officials who have been forced to acknowledge these seemingly impossible transformations. While the practice of Trul Core Tibetan dream yoga would have taught Jesus to maintain full consciousness during sleep states and even project his awareness into other dimensions, abilities he later demonstrated in his appearances after the crucifixion and in his supernatural knowledge of events occurring at distant locations. The system of chakras, the energy centers aligned along the spinal column, was thoroughly understood by Tibetan and Indian masters who could manipulate these subtle energy vortexes to produce extraordinary physical and mental abilities, including the generation of inner heat that allows practitioners to survive naked in sub-freezing temperatures, the projection of consciousness beyond the physical body, and the direct perception of other beings' thoughts and emotions, abilities that Jesus clearly possessed and demonstrated throughout his ministry but which the Church has consistently attributed to his divine nature rather than acknowledging them as the natural result of advanced spiritual training available to all dedicated practitioners. The ancient science of sound, preserved in the Sanskrit tradition as mantra yoga and in the Egyptian mysteries as the power of the word, taught that specific sound frequencies could directly manipulate matter at the atomic level, a principle that modern quantum physics is only beginning to understand through research into cymatics and vibrational medicine, but which ancient initiates used to perform seeming miracles like healing diseases, transmuting elements, and even affecting weather patterns, abilities that Jesus demonstrated when he calmed storms, healed the sick through spoken commands, and fed multitudes through the multiplication of existing matter. All applications of acoustic technologies that were common knowledge in the mystery schools but have been lost to mainstream civilization, though they are slowly being rediscovered by researchers like Dr. Masaru Emoto, who proved that human consciousness and intention can directly affect the molecular structure of water, the same principle underlying Jesus' transformation of water into wine at the wedding in Cana. The 18 years of intensive training would have culminated in the ultimate initiation, the conscious experience of death and resurrection, a practice common to all advanced mystery schools where initiates learn to separate their consciousness from the physical body, journey through the afterlife dimensions, and return with direct knowledge of the soul's immortal nature, an experience that prepared Jesus for his eventual crucifixion and resurrection, events that were not unique supernatural miracles but the practical demonstration of abilities developed through decades of systematic spiritual training. For the ancient initiates understood that consciousness is independent of the physical brain and can continue to operate even when the body appears clinically dead, a principle that modern near-death research is confirming through the work of scientists like Dr. Raymond Moody and Dr. Eben Alexander, who have documented cases of verified consciousness activity during periods of measurable brain death. The return to Palestine would have presented Jesus with the challenge of adapting these advanced teachings to a culture that was largely unprepared for such radical concepts, forcing him to encode the deeper mysteries in parables and symbolic language that could be understood at multiple levels, with the masses receiving moral instruction while serious disciples were gradually initiated into the deeper practices, a teaching method common to all wisdom traditions where esoteric knowledge is carefully protected from those who might misuse it while being made available to those who demonstrate genuine spiritual maturity, hence his frequent admonition that he who has ears to hear, let him hear, and his private instruction to the apostles about mysteries that were not shared with the general public. The Gnostic Gospels, discovered at Nag Hammadi in 1945, preserve many of these esoteric teachings that were edited out of the canonical Gospels by the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE, including detailed instructions on meditation practices, the divine nature of feminine energy, and the systematic methodology for achieving direct union with divine consciousness. Teachings that clearly reflect the influence of Eastern wisdom traditions and suggest that Jesus' original message was far more sophisticated and comprehensive than the simplified version preserved in mainstream Christianity, for documents like the Gospel of Thomas contain sayings that are virtually identical to passages from Buddhist and Hindu texts, while the Gospel of Philip describes advanced energy practices for sacred partnership that mirror tantric methodologies, and the Gospel of Mary reveals that Mary Magdalene was not a reformed prostitute but a fully initiated priestess who received teachings that the male apostles were unable to understand or accept due to their cultural conditioning about the spiritual inferiority of women. The systematic suppression of these teachings began almost immediately after Jesus' death, as the early church struggled to establish institutional authority and could not allow the revolutionary implications of his actual message to undermine hierarchical control. For if every individual could achieve direct communion with divine consciousness through proper spiritual practice, there would be no need for ecclesiastical intermediaries, no justification for papal authority, and no basis for the Church's claims to exclusive salvation, hence the violent persecution of Gnostic Christians, the destruction of mystery school traditions throughout the Roman Empire, and the deliberate creation of a simplified theology that emphasized belief over direct experience, substituting faith in external salvation for the demanding but transformative work of inner spiritual development that Jesus himself had undergone during his years of mystery school training. The influence of Jesus's Eastern education can be traced throughout his teachings, from his emphasis on compassion and non-judgment that reflects Buddhist philosophy, to his understanding of the unity underlying apparent diversity that mirrors Vedantic realization, to his use of breath work and energy transmission that demonstrates familiarity with yogic practices, to his sophisticated understanding of consciousness states that reveals knowledge of advanced meditation techniques, all pointing to a comprehensive spiritual education that far exceeded anything available in first-century Palestine but was consistent with the integrated wisdom curriculum maintained by the mystery schools throughout the ancient world, schools that understood that true spiritual mastery required not theological study but direct experiential knowledge of the fundamental unity underlying all existence, knowledge that could only be achieved through systematic practice under the guidance of those who had already achieved such realization. The implications of acknowledging Jesus's mystery school education are profound, for they restore his teachings to their proper context within the perennial philosophy that has been preserved by authentic spiritual traditions throughout history, revealing that Christianity at its deepest level is not a unique religion but a particular expression of universal truths that have been discovered and transmitted by realized beings in every culture and every age, truths that are available to all sincere seekers who are willing to undertake the same demanding process of purification, study and practice that transformed the young Jewish carpenter into one of history's greatest spiritual teachers, a transformation that was not the result of unique divine intervention but the natural outcome of systematic spiritual development according to methods that have been preserved and transmitted by authentic lineage holders throughout the centuries, methods that are still available today to those who seek them with genuine dedication and proper guidance. The recovery of these lost years also explains many of the apparent contradictions and mysteries in the canonical Gospels, such as Jesus's supernatural knowledge of Jewish law despite his humble background, his familiarity with complex theological concepts that would have required years of advanced study, his ability to debate with learned rabbis and Pharisees on equal terms, his sophisticated understanding of human psychology and group dynamics, his mastery of healing techniques that combined physical, emotional, and spiritual intervention, and his profound insights into the nature of consciousness, death, and transcendence that far exceeded anything taught in conventional Jewish schools but were consistent with the advanced curriculum of the mystery schools where such knowledge was systematically preserved and transmitted through carefully structured initiatory programs designed to produce fully realized spiritual masters capable of serving humanity's spiritual evolution. The suppression of this knowledge has had catastrophic consequences for Western spiritual development, creating a culture that worships Jesus while ignoring his actual teachings, that claims to follow his example while rejecting the very practices that made his realization possible, that has reduced the profound mysteries of consciousness transformation into simplistic doctrines of belief and salvation that require no personal effort or spiritual discipline, effectively preventing the masses from achieving the same divine realization that Jesus demonstrated was the natural birthright of every human being, for his repeated emphasis that, "These things that I do, you shall do also, and greater things than these," was not empty rhetoric but a promise based on his direct knowledge that the consciousness he had achieved was available to all who were willing to undertake the necessary preparation, study, and practice, the same systematic spiritual development that he himself had undergone during his years of mystery school training. The modern rediscovery of these suppressed teachings through archaeological finds like the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Nag Hammadi Library, combined with growing Western interest in Eastern spirituality and the scientific validation of consciousness research, creates an unprecedented opportunity to restore Jesus's message to its original context and to reclaim the practical methodologies for spiritual transformation that were the true foundation of his ministry, methodologies that integrate the wisdom of all authentic spiritual traditions into a comprehensive system for human awakening that honors both the transcendent and immanent aspects of divine reality, both the individual and universal dimensions of consciousness, both the theoretical understanding and practical application of spiritual principles, creating the possibility for a new era of spiritual renaissance based not on blind faith or institutional authority but on direct experiential knowledge of the divine nature that underlies all existence, knowledge that can be verified through proper spiritual practice by anyone who approaches it with sufficient sincerity, dedication, and guidance from those who have already walked this ancient path of transformation. If this journey into the hidden years of Jesus Christ resonated with your soul, share this wisdom with fellow seekers and join our community of truth explorers. Let us know in the comments what aspect of this ancient knowledge calls to your spirit, for the path of awakening is walked together. Thank you, soul traveler, for joining this exploration of the mysteries.